The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
To every schoolboy, chestnuts are currency. Like marbles or baseball cards, you can trade them, or you can make bubble pipes out of them. And they're wonderful to throw. But wait till you see what we're going to do with chestnuts today on the French Chef. Chef, I'm Julia Child. Today we're going to do a show on chestnuts. I think it's an awfully good idea to do one because they're so good to eat and you can do so many different kinds of things with them. And a lot of us sort of are confused by chestnuts and don't really quite know how they can be used. Of course, 40 years ago, the country abounded in chestnut trees and everybody knew everything about them. But then a great blight came along and wiped every chestnut tree off the face of the nation. Of course, we still have horse chestnuts, but they're not edible. Even horses don't eat them. And our edible chestnuts come from Europe, mostly from Italy. And when they come, you find them in the market very often in a sack like that, or else just whole and loose. And when you buy fresh chestnuts, you want to be sure that they're nice and heavy when you feel them, and that also that the nut and the skin are really tightly close together, and that shows that they're really fresh. And you can buy either fresh chestnuts or canned chestnuts, and we're going to start out with the fresh ones. And fresh chestnuts, of course, when they grow on the tree, they have a big sort of nubbly green skin on them, and when the frost comes, the skin cracks and then the nut falls to the ground. And there it is, and it has an outer shell, and then it has an inner skin. And both of them are very close fitting. You see, there's that sort of brown inner skin, and then this is the white part of the nut. And before you're going to eat chestnuts, and before you're going to use them, you have to peel them, and then you have to cook them. And there are hundreds, of not hundreds, but a good dozen ways of peeling chestnuts. I've tried all of them, and I'm going to do the one that I like the best. And in that one, you take your whole chestnut, and as you notice, there's a little flat side usually, and then the rounded side. And you take a sharp little knife, and you just peel a strip of the outside shell off of each chestnut. That one already has been peeled. That one's fairly round. You have to make a little hole in it, like that. I'll do one more. And that's fairly quickly done. And then you take all of your chestnuts that you have peeled this little strip off, and you drop them in a pan of cold water, and then you bring the water up to the boil, and you let it boil for 1 minute. And then, after it's boiled for 1 minute, you take it off the heat, and then you take a slotted spoon and you lift them out 3 at a time, and both the outer shell and the inner skin should come off. And you just take them with a knife and just peel them like that. And you have to do it when the chestnuts are warm. You suddenly have a whole bunch of chestnuts to do, and you've peeled half of them, and then you have to go out and do something else. The water cools off, then you find you can't peel them. As you see, this way, the skin and the shell both come off, and if you're doing a whole bunch of them, once in a while you'll come to a non-peeler, and set all your non-peelers aside and drop them in boiling water and let them sit for about a minute, and then you can peel the skin off. And it's quite a chore to peel them, but if you have 3 or 4 people and you're all sitting around watching the TV, educational TV, it's a great deal of fun. And it's sort of a nice communal activity. And then after you have them all peeled, you have to cook them. And to do that, you put them in a pan. And I found too that after you've peeled them, you don't want to set them aside covered, because sometimes they can become a what is it? Moldy. So you really should peel them and cook them about at the same day, or if you have peeled them ahead of time, don't cover them in their bowl. Then you put them in your pan, and then you cover them with a meat stock or chicken stock. I'm using a beef bouillon there, and then some water. And you want to be sure that the liquid covers them thoroughly, because they won't cook if the liquid doesn't cover them completely. Then you're going to flavor it with some celery. It always goes well with celery. There's a nice limp piece that is better for cooking than for eating. And we want some parsley, and we want a bay leaf, and then we want some thyme. And this is some fresh thyme that somebody grew in their garden and sent to me. You just grow it in the summertime and then hang it up in the attic and let it dry. And if you have whole thyme like this, you just wrap it up in with your celery and parsley and bend it around and then tie it up with white string. If you don't have whole thyme, if you just have dried bottle thyme, then make your herb bouquet and tie it up in wet cheesecloth. And the reason you tie it up is that so you can remove it, and you don't want a lot of loose herbs floating around in your stock. There. Then you bring that up to the simmer, and then let it cook very, very slowly for about 35 to 40 minutes. We want the chestnuts to remain whole if you're going to use them for a stuffing, or if you're going to use them as a whole vegetable, and they're very attractive when they're done that way. And about 35 to 40 minutes of a very slow simmer. If it really boils hard, then the chestnuts will separate, and we want them to keep as whole as possible. Then, after 35 to 40 minutes, you have your cooked chestnuts. And the best way to tell when they're cooked is just to eat one. And they should be so that when you eat it, it tastes like a cooked chestnut, and it isn't hard. And when you've finished that, you can let your chestnuts sit in your stock for, for a day or two in the refrigerator. Then, here are some canned chestnuts. I brought these out because I thought you'd like to see them. I have frankly never used canned chestnuts until I was getting ready to show you about chestnuts, and I'm sort of a do-it-yourself type, and I've always thought, they'd be really not very good. I find they're simply delicious. And the canned chestnut here that you buy has come up to exactly the same stage as the chestnut that you would cook yourself. It doesn't have quite the same texture and flavor, and when you buy them, it says canned whole chestnuts for stuffing, and it's just chestnuts and water. And if you want to give them some flavor, if you're going to use them for a vegetable, you would then heat them, pour them into a pan, and bring them just up to the simmer, and then drain out the liquid, which you can save for something else, and then put in some stock and seasonings, just the way we have with these. Bring that up for the simmer for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then let them steep for half an hour. And you want to give them some kind of a flavor, otherwise they're not very interesting. And 35 to 40 whole chestnuts will give you about 2.5 cups of peeled chestnuts, and 6 to 8 cups of chestnuts are about enough for if you're going to make a chestnut puree. And so now that we have both our cooked and our canned chestnuts, I'm going to show you what you can do with them. And one of the very nice things to do with whole chestnuts is to glaze them. And for that, you take some of the stock that you've cooked them with and mix it with a little bit of cornstarch and a little bit of port wine, and then put it in a little pan. I'm just going to do a very few of them so you can see how it is. And then you let that come up to the simmer, and then you put some of your chestnuts in. Now, I've got a slotted spoon somewhere. Oh, I've got another one. Oh, there's my slotted spoon. And then you put some of your ready cooked chestnuts in there. These should all, of course, be whole. Some of these aren't, but it really doesn't make too much difference. And then you just shake that around over heat until your glaze has melted down and covered your chestnuts. And then you just put them in a little dish or along with any other kind of vegetables that you would like, such as onions and carrots. And that makes an extremely nice vegetable and a very pretty one, and also very good to eat. And then we have our classic chestnut puree, which is something that we always have you always have with goose or turkey, if you get around to making it. But it's awfully good, and particularly with your canned chestnuts, it's extremely easy to make. Now here, a puree just means that you've sieved things, and this is a food mill, and this is a particularly nice one, which I thought you would like to see. It comes with 3 blades. There's a coarse blade, and there's a very fine blade, and then this is the medium blade, which we're going to use. A lot of these don't have various blades, but I think the one that has the interchangeable one is extremely useful. And you fit the blade in, and then you put in this whizzer thing that forces everything through. Then there's our herb bouquet, which we can now get rid of. And then you pour the whole business into your food mill, letting it drain, and then pour the liquid back into the pan, and then you just start to push them through. You notice on this food mill it has these little feet, which is a new invention, a new innovation. This is the new model. And then you just push them right through. And if you're going to puree canned chestnuts, you have to be sure to heat them through until it's just up to until they come up at a simmer, and let them simmer for a moment or two so that you can puree them. Otherwise, they'd be a little too hard to get through the food mill. Now, chestnuts are really quite a dry kind of a thing, so you've got to flavor it up with cream or butter. You notice all of the puree down there, so you always scrape that off. Then you have your puree, so you want to flavor that up. You put in a little bit of the stock in which you cooked it. You know, in France, chestnuts have been eaten for thousands of years. And before they had potatoes, they used chestnuts instead of potatoes. Then you put in a little bit of softened butter, and then salt and pepper to taste. And you can get the chestnuts done way ahead of time, as long as when they're done, you don't cover them until they're absolutely cold. And then to reheat them again, you would set your bowl or saucepan over simmering water and then stir them up every once in a while until they were nicely heated through, and then you might want to beat in a little more salt and pepper. So that's all there is to making a very good chestnut puree, which you would serve with goose or turkey. Or it goes awfully nicely with pork, too. And now we're going to get to our chestnut dessert. And this one, I'm going to use canned chestnuts, just because I want to show you how you can make a very quick and very elegant dessert in no time at all. And with the canned chestnuts, of course, they haven't had any other flavoring with them at all, and so you want to flavor them with some sugar, but you don't want the sugar to be granulated, so that you melt some sugar in a little pan with either some water or some port wine. And I'm going to use 5½ cups of chestnuts. That would be 2 cans. And so I'm going to use half a cup of sugar and about 4 or 5 tablespoons of port wine. Then we have our chestnut puree over here. And that's 5½ cups, or two of these large cans. And then I'm going to put some chocolate in it. That's 8 ounces of melted chocolate. When you think of that chestnuts are really just sort of a nut or a flower, they need quite a bit of flavoring when you're going to use them. something like a dessert. That's 8 ounces of melted chocolate. And then I'm going to start whizzing them around. You can do all of this by hand, of course. And then we're going to put some butter in, because this is going to be a molded dessert. And the butter, and both the butter and the chocolate will, when it gets into the refrigerator, will, congeal and hold the dessert up. And you'll find, too, with the chestnuts, because they're rather dry, that you want quite a bit of butter. And it's also a heavy dessert, so don't be shocked at this amount of butter, because this is going to serve about 10 or 12 people. I've got about half a pound in there. And I'm going to go back and look at my sugar and see how that is. Now that's all melted, so that can go right in at the same time. Now if you're going to do fresh chestnuts, this way you would simmer your peeled chestnuts in a sugar syrup. You use about a cup of sugar to each quart of water. And then you put in a vanilla bean. Now, I'll have to put that down a little bit. That's mixed up nicely enough. Now we're going to flavor it. It really needs a little bit of wine flavoring, at least if you're going to be French. I'm going to put in, you can put in rum or kirsch. I'm going to put in some rum, and I think I'm going to put in about 4 tablespoons of rum, and then taste it and see how it is. And I'm going to put in a little vanilla too, because everything's supposed to have vanilla in it. I'll put in a tablespoon of vanilla. Now we'll just taste it and see if it needs any more wine in it. If you don't like actual wine or liquor, you can always use imitation rum flavoring. Looks pretty good. I think it needs just a little tiny bit of salt. It's interesting how many times sweet things do need a little salt. It sort of brings out more of their character. I put in just about a quarter of a teaspoon there. Now that's mixed up well enough. Of course, you don't have to do this in a mixer at all. You can just mix it all in by hand. Oh, there, I'll put that there. We'll take this off and then give it some final tasting and see how it is. You see how very quick that is to make. Now, what we're going to do with this, we're going to make what is called a palissade au marron. The French word for chestnut is marron. And this is going to be a dessert molded in cookies. And you can make it in one of these rather high-sided molds. This is a Charlotte mold, which the French use such a great deal. The sides are about 3.5 inches high. And if you're going to do that, you have to have some cookies that are going to be exactly the same shape, because we're same length, because we're going to cook cookies all around the side there. And the classical French cookie would be these little langue de chat, or cat's tongues, and these are made just out of egg whites and sugar and butter. And then you would arrange them all the way around like that. But that also takes quite a bit of extra time. And if you're in a hurry, you can just go out and buy some nice cookies. And you can use just an ordinary low-sided dish. This is just a souffle mold. And the ideal cookie, I didn't find the ideal one, would be this very little thin sugar cookie, which would fit just about like that in the mold. I didn't find that kind, so I got this kind, which is a double cookie, and it has a little chocolate on the inside, but that's going to be very nice too. So I'll use that. And then you have your mold, and then you cut a piece of wax paper just the same size as the bottom of the mold, and then you put in a little bit of your chocolate mixture, chocolate and chestnut, and that is so that you want to have sort of of a foundation so that this will hold up the cookies when we put them around. Then, you see, we have this lining of our chestnut mixture, and then you just stick the cookies in all around. I've got another dessert already made, and you're going to see how nice this is. Rather nice, and having extra chocolate never hurts anything if you like chocolate the way I do. And then you just simply fill the rest of your mold with your chestnut mixture. You really wouldn't ever know that was a chestnut mixture. I suppose this was invented by the French. That's because they had so many chestnuts, they didn't know what to do with them. Then you have your mold all filled, and should cover it with waxed paper and a rubber band, and then put it in the refrigerator. And that you should finish this probably 6 or 7 hours ahead of time, because you really have to give it time to for the chocolate and the butter to set. So otherwise, if you unmolded it before it was set, it would just be sort of this wet mixture that you now see. So we'll put that in the refrigerator. And then I'll take out one that I have already made. I made this one in the high-sided Charlotte mold with those little cat's tongues, so that you can sort of get an idea of how glorious it can be if you have one of these great big, if you have one of these high molds. And now this, you think, oh dear, this is never going to unmold. But it does, as you will see. Now you take a knife and you go all the way around the edge. Be sure that you get all the way around the outside. Just sort of cutting it in like that. I can already feel it beginning to budge just a little bit, so I'm quite sure it's going to unmold nicely. Then, of course, the paper on the bottom is not buttered. You want to be sure that it isn't buttered. I can see that's budging very nicely, so it's going to unmold well. Then you put your dish on upside down and just turn it over. Center it nicely. There we are. There we are. Now, see, those were made with these little cat's tongues. And I think it really looks very nicely indeed. And then this, as I said, this is a heavy dessert. It's really sort of like a candy cake. So that this is a 6-cup mold, and I think this would probably very nicely serve 10 people, because you just want to give them a very small amount of it. And then, because it's dry and heavy, you want also to have some kind of a sauce to go with it. I would serve either a very lightly whipped cream or else one of those English custard sauces that would be either flavored with a little bit of rum or with vanilla. And then you have a perfectly delicious dessert. Now, another thing that you can do with this very same mixture would be you put it into the refrigerator until it has become fairly nicely sort of congealed, so that you can work it around, and then you can roll it out with your hands until you make a little sort of nice little candy ball. And then you can roll that in chocolate shot and put it in a little paper cup, and you have a perfectly delicious little homemade candy. So you really have quite a few things that you can do with this. So now I think I shall take this into the dining room, and we will see what we have accomplished. Now let's take a look at what we've done with all these chestnuts. Here are our glazed chestnuts, and they're surrounded in a very beautiful way by a spoke of braised carrots and little glazed onions, and that makes a very attractive vegetable dish to serve along with your goose or your turkey, or it goes very nicely with duck or with pork. And then here is our classic chestnut puree. And And this you use instead of mashed potatoes. And you'd serve that also with goose or turkey or duck. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the canned chestnut business. Canned chestnuts, as you've seen, are really a great blessing, though an expensive one. One can, which weighs about 1 pound 5 ounces, they're all put up in France, and that costs about $1.50. And then a little bag of fresh chestnuts costs about 39 or 40 cents. So it's about canned chestnuts are about 3 times more expensive. But for a party or when you want to be fancy and you don't have a great deal of time, they're just canned chestnuts are just wonderful to have on hand. But remember when you use them that you have to flavor them up with something else. As I mentioned, if you're going to use them as canned whole chestnuts for a vegetable, you would heat them in a pan and then pour off their liquid and then pour in some meat stock and herbs and let it simmer for about 5 minutes and then let them sit and absorb the flavor. And then you will have extremely good whole chestnuts as a garniture, or if you wanted to use the whole chestnuts in the stuffing of a goose or a turkey, you would then drain them after they had soaked up all the flavor and let them cool, and then you would stuff them in your goose or your turkey and accompany them with, put in some brown sausages, or you could put in prunes, or you could put in apples, or if you're feeling very flush, you could even put in some truffles, but that makes an extremely good stuffing. And now we will get to our dessert, our palissade de marron, or chestnut palissade. And I think I will carve you a piece so you can see how it looks on the plate. And these cookies, of course, which are crisp little cookies when they start out, are after they've sat with the chestnuts and the chocolate in the refrigerator, they soften up so that you can cut them nicely. So there you have something that looks just like a cake. And because you do need some kind of a sauce with it, we're going to just serve a little lightly whipped cream that's been with some a little bit of sugar folded into it and some rum. And that makes a perfectly delicious dessert, which I think you will enjoy very much. And so, remember what you can do with chestnuts. These are only 3 recipes, but they're all extremely good ones. And you can use either the fresh chestnuts, which are certainly something to peel, but it's well worth it. So there we have 3 happy endings to a 1/2 hour show. So give the old chestnut a try. That's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appetit and enjoy cooking chestnuts.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores. The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
I'm making one of America's and the world's most favorite dishes, hamburger. But this is hamburger done in the French way with seasonings and onions, and we're going to make a lovely sauce for it. And besides hamburgers, we're going to do all kinds of steaks, because this is the steak and hamburger show today on the French Chef. Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we're doing steaks and hamburgers, and we're starting out with hamburger. We're going to go rather from the humble to the king's palace, which I think will be great fun. I've got here about 2 pounds of hamburger. Many people have an idea that the French are just so fancy that they don't eat hamburgers at all, but they do. They call them beefsteak haché or bitoc, and they're perfectly delicious the way they do it, because you can make a lovely sauce with them and you can use it as a company dish. Now I've got 2 pounds of hamburger in here, and I'm going to mix in about a cup of onions which have been cooked in butter. Then I'm going to put in a whole egg. That keeps the hamburger together as you cook it. And then I'm going to put in a little bit of herbs. You can use thyme or sage. I'm using Italian seasoning, which I like very much. It's a combination of everything. That's about 1/4 of a teaspoonful. And then it should have about a teaspoon of salt and a good grinding of pepper. And then beat it up. You have to beat it so that it will stay nicely together. It becomes rather light looking. Now this hamburger that I'm using is from the neck. It's a combination of neck and plate, and it costs about 55 cents a pound. And neck, plate, and chuck have a perfectly fine, lovely, sort of meaty taste, and they're the least expensive. And when you're buying it, sometimes, they call hamburgers by awfully fancy names, such as chopped sirloin. And chopped sirloin, all that is just the tail of a sirloin steak. And it's only really stew or hamburger meat anyway, but it sounds as though it were so good, and it has a fancy name. And it's the same thing with ground round. That's just the tough muscles of the round that you couldn't possibly use as a steak. And I think that there's no sense in paying 99 cents for hamburger the way a lot of people do, just because it has a fancy name. And if you go to your market, just say that you like a combination of neck and plate, and you want the meat to have only 7 to 10% of fat. That's about 3 tablespoons of fat per pound of meat. And then you form it into cakes like that. I've already formed some already. And then when you get them all formed into cakes, you can just put them in the ice box, covered with wax paper, and then cook them when you're ready to. Well, I'm heating up oil and butter in my no-stick pan, and then just before you're going to cook the hamburgers, you dredge them in a little bit of flour. That also helps to brown them and helps them keep together. But you don't want to dredge them in flour until just before you cook them. You don't need very much flour at all. There. Now those are all ready to go as soon as our butter and oil are hot. As you notice, as usual, we always saute in, though we say we saute in butter, it's always oil and butter, so the butter won't burn. Now that's good and hot, so in go the hamburgers. This mixture of onions just makes an awfully good hamburger. Much more interesting than just sort of plain meat. And now, while those are cooking, I'm going to show you a very nice sauce. We're going to do what's called a sauce bordelaise, which is a red wine sauce with beef marrow. Now this is raw beef marrow that's been diced up. And I'll show you how you go about it. A marrow bone, you see, this this little part in here is the marrow. And that's a fatty substance. And you usually can't get your butcher to do this, but it's very easy to do yourself. Get a big cleaver and then something to hit it with, and just cut it right down the middle. Whack. Then, see, there's your marrow. You just take your little knife and take it out like that. And then particularly if the bone is cold and the marrow is cold, when you cut it, you want it to keep in the dice. So you dip your knife in some hot liquid. I've got some hot stock here. You just use hot water and cut it, and then it doesn't break apart. If it's cold and you try to cut it with a cold knife, it'll just crumble, and you want it to stay whole. Then you have hot liquid, either hot salted water. I've got some hot beef stock here. And you just put that in, and that poaches the marrow. You don't want it to boil at all, and you don't want the liquid to be too hot. You just want the marrow to soften. And now we'll take a look at our hamburgers again. I must say I like these no-stick pans, and this is a new type of rubber spatula that's, I guess, non-inflammable or non-burnable. Anyway, it's perfect for the no-stick pan. Then, when our hamburgers are done, on each side we will make our sauce. And the marrow can take about 5 minutes or so in hot liquid, and then just drain it out. And there it is in the sieve, ready to use. And now I'm going to get our hot platter. Be sure you always have your platter hot. I've got this in the oven. This is just in the warming oven. Then your hamburgers are done. On they go onto your hot platter. I think it's hard to say how long to cook hamburgers, because some people like them very rare and some people like them well done. I think that's something that you can't give any rules for because it's so personal. And now here's our hamburger pan, and it still has a little bit of butter in it, and it also has these nice little coagulated juices. And we're going to deglaze the pan. This is a little bit of our beef stock. I'll put in about 1/4 of a cup. And then we have our red wine. This is a California mountain wine. You just let that boil down, and then we're going to give it a little bit of thickening with cornstarch. I'm going to put in about 1/2 tablespoon, and then add a little bit more red wine there. And then pour it in. You want to let it cook for about a moment. Then take it off the heat and fold in the marrow. And you put in a little bit of chopped parsley too, and that just goes over your hamburgers. That really makes hamburgers go on to heaven. And then you can put a little parsley in there to decorate it. And there you are. Now I'm going to show you about steaks. That's going from the 55-cent hamburger to a porterhouse steak. That's a 4-pound porterhouse steak, and it costs $6.17. It comes from a prime carcass. It's about the best porterhouse I've ever seen in my life. It comes from right here, the loin. And this, we've made a beef chart for you so that you could get some idea of where the meat cuts come from. See, this is the head of the beef right here, and there's his neck, and there's his shoulder blade, and his front leg, and there are all of his ribs. There's his backbone, and his pelvic bone, and there's his back leg. And you'd be very wise to get yourself just as familiar with beef cuts as possible, because you can save yourself a lot of money and a lot of disappointment. Now, I'll show you some more from that fancy area. That's the loin strip steak. That is the loin part of the porterhouse steak, and that costs about $2 a pound if it's a prime carcass. And that comes from up here in the loin also. Now if you're in the money, another expensive steak is from the sirloin. And the sirloin is right here. That has this great big pelvic bone in there. And that's sometimes called sirloin rump. Some butchers don't make any distinction between it. And this is a hip steak that I had here, and that costs about $1.89 a pound. And now to get these two sections here, the loin and the sirloin, are the most expensive. That's the most expensive. But you don't have to go into all that money to get yourself a good steak. We have here, this is a blade steak. That comes from the shoulder. It comes from right up here at the end of the shoulder blade, and you can always see a little bit of cartilage from the blade in the steak. And that costs about $1.19 a pound, and it's a very good steak. And now here is something that you want to watch out for. You'd say, oh, goody, if you saw this enormous piece of meat for about $2.19 for 4 pounds. And what this is a chuck steak. And they often have it in a market on display for the unwary. You have here, sort of hard to hold, you have this part and this part here, which are just stewing meat, and that's no good for a steak. The only good part of this steak is from here up into there. That's really like part of your rib, like the roast beef. That would be a very good steak boned out, and that would cost you 89 cents a pound. And we have that chuck steak comes from up in here. And we have now a flank steak, and that costs about 99 cents a pound. And when you buy one, be sure you get a good thick one. And it's always good to marinate it in a little red wine and herbs, and then you just broil it like an ordinary steak, and you cut it on the slant that way, and it makes a very nice, tasty steak. And that one comes from right here. That's 99 cents a pound. And let's see if I think I have another one here. Yeah. Now that again is a shoulder steak, and this is a delicious steak. We had one last night. You can always tell it's a shoulder if you're good at meat cuts, because there's this little piece of gristle right in there. And that comes from in this area too. And that is $1.19 a pound. So as you see, you can get very good steaks without spending a fortune for them. The important thing is to know your butcher and begin learning your meat cuts. And now I'm going to show you one of the most expensive. I think it's nice to go from the least expensive to the most. Now this here as a whole is a filet of beef. And that's the tenderloin section of your porterhouse. And that's up in the loin, right? This part here is after the hip and before the rib, and that's the filet or tenderloin. And then there's this, if you have absolutely the whole thing, you'd have this other part down here, which is called the sirloin butt, and that's not as tender as the rest of the steak and not considered quite as good. And that, if you buy a hip or sirloin steak, you get a bit in there of that. And this tenderloin, this piece cost $13. That was from a prime carcass. Prime means that's the first grade and best of beef. And this little part, see that? It gets thick there, and then it thins out to down here. And this little part down in here is called the filet mignon. Mignon means little. And so when you get a filet mignon, it's cut from a small part down there, and sometimes they're only that big around. And this is the heart or central part. And if you get a great big steak cut from there that's about like that, that's called a chateaubriand. And it's usually about 2 inches thick, and it's always broiled. And then smaller steaks from this region that would be about an inch thick are called filet steaks or tornadoes. And you can roast this whole thing. It's delicious. It doesn't have as much flavor as the loin strip or the chuck, but it is an elegant piece of meat. And now here, there is a steak just cut from the filet like that. And usually this little piece here is cut off, and also that fat there. And if you have it trimmed so that's cut off, I don't know how much a pound that would be. It would be very expensive. But you cut off this fat part here. And also it's supposed to have all the filament cut off as well. I think I'd better see a little more closely. You notice that there's sort of a fatty and a filamenty part there, and that should also be removed. I didn't have this removed because I thought it was a good idea for you to see what it was all like. But it would be easier to take off if you took it off from the whole strip, because your butcher would just take these pieces with his knife and just go up them like that. And that ends you up with just a little tiny, lovely nugget of meat. Now here's another one that hasn't had that little strip taken off. But if you don't have these strips taken off, then the meat curls up. And if you want, you can have a piece of fat pork tied right around that, so it makes it look very nice and neat. I don't actually think it's necessary to do, but it sort of particularly makes it look more elegant in the store. Now with this, we saute them in butter, but it's butter as usual with a little bit of oil added to it. You want to be sure, as always, when you're sauteing anything, that you have your butter and oil hot. Put these over here. And also you want to be sure that your meat is dry. This is perfectly dry, but if it weren't, you take paper towels and wipe it off, because you want it to be sure you want it to brown nicely, and it won't brown at all if it's damp. Now we look at our butter, see that foam is still rising. And as soon as it begins going down again, we'll add the steaks. I always go through this rigmarole, but I think it's so important that you don't forget to dry the meat and heat the fat very hot. Now that butter foam has subsided, but the butter hasn't started to brown, so in go the steaks. And we regulate the heat. We do not want the butter to brown, because we want to be able to use that also for the sauce that we're going to make. And now whenever you are doing something fancy that costs $2.50 a pound, you want to surround it with fine wines and truffles and anything else that's absolutely delicious. So I'm going to get out what we have, and I'm going to first turn the steaks. Those are browning nicely on that side. And I'm going to get out my hot steak platter. This again is in the warming oven. For it, we're going to put these steaks on little toast. This is white bread with a crust sauce, which has been sauteed in butter until it gets to be a nice golden brown. You want to watch it carefully, not get your butter too hot, and then just saute it until it gets this brown, and then keep it warm on the oven. The steaks will go on that. We also have here some béarnaise sauce. You remember we've done hollandaise sauce. This is exactly like hollandaise, except instead of having lemon juice in it, it has wine, vinegar, and shallots, and pepper, and tarragon, and you've put in about a quarter of a cup. Boil it down until it's about 2 tablespoons. and then you proceed to make your hollandaise with that. And it's a lovely sauce and very good for steak. And now let's look at our steaks again. Now this again depends on whether you like them terribly rare or whether you like them what they call medium rare or pink in the middle. And when you press them with your finger, you can tell very much how they are. This finger test is very useful to know. If you press it down and it's soft and squashy but brown on the outside, it's good and rare. But as soon as you see a little bit of pearling of pink juice come up, then it's medium rare. I'm going to serve these fairly rare, so I'm going to consider them done. So we put them on our toast. Then we have some artichoke hearts. Now first I'm going to have to deglaze that pan before I do with the artichoke hearts. This is the same type of deglaze that we did before. We're going to put in a little bit of minced shallot and stir that around for a moment. Because they're always a little coagulated meat juice, and that's one of the reasons that pan sauteed steaks are so good. Because you can make a lovely sauce with them. That should cook for just about a minute. And then I'm going to put in some port wine. Use either port or Madeira. And remember, as with this, if you pay this much for your steak, you don't want to skimp on the wine. You don't have to use wine for it. You could use a little bit of beef stock if you wanted. And then let that reduce a little while. And I'm going to have also some asparagus tips. These were cooked and then warm, and then you warm them in butter and be sure that they're seasoned just right. Now our sauce is reduced down nicely, and we should salt and pepper the steaks first. You don't salt and pepper until they're done, and then pour the sauce over. This kind of a deglazing sauce is really just an extension of the steak flavor and very typical of France. And then we have cooked artichoke hearts, which we put in top. And if you wanted to, you could even top it with a piece of foie gras. That would be going pretty far, I think. And then fill the artichoke hearts with your béarnaise sauce. This béarnaise always goes very nicely with a filet steak, because they don't have tremendous amount of flavor of their own, even though they are so expensive. So you can use a sauce like this, and then that would be topped with just a little bit of parsley like that. Then we'll arrange the asparagus around. This dish is called filet tournedos Henri IV, or Henry IV. Oh, I was very neat with that. If you didn't want to have artichoke hearts, you could have large mushroom hearts, which you broiled in the oven until they were just tender, and then put the sauce in that. And then we have some sauteed potatoes, and those can go in the middle. And then if you feel that people want a little bit more béarnaise sauce, you could pass the rest of it in a separate bowl. And that should have a little bit of parsley. And then if you were feeling very frisky, you could always have a little bit of diced chopped truffle, which you could pour over. That would be nice. There. Now that's all ready to serve. I might tell you something about how to do an artichoke heart. They're also an expensive luxury. You don't cook the artichoke heart. You don't cook the whole artichoke heart first. What you do is you peel it off like that, and you take your fingers and bend it down that way. And bend off all the leaves until you've come up. You see, by this bending and pulling movement, you're still keeping on the eatable part of the leaves. And when you've come up to about there, you cut it off. And then you trim off the bottom with your knife. You want to trim off all the little green parts. You just want to leave just purely white flesh, and that's what's tender. Anything that's green isn't tender. Then when you've finished with that, you keep rubbing it with lemon. Then you cook it in a mixture of flour, a little bit of flour and water and lemon juice and salt until it's tender. Now we have our most elegant filet steaks, tournedos Henri IV. And with this we have spared nothing but truffles, which we could have used. And with it we're going to serve a perfectly delicious red Bordeaux wine at room temperature. And again, you don't skimp on the wine if you're going to spend a lot of money on good meat. And we have then, turning from the sublime to the more humble, we have our hamburgers. And the hamburgers are served with this very nice sauce of red wine and marrow. And this you could perfectly well use as a company dish. You could serve it with sauteed potatoes, potato crepes, buttered peas, and then with it you wouldn't have to serve a very fancy wine. You would use something like a Beaujolais or a California Mountain Red, which would be very good indeed, and possibly a green salad and French bread. Now, the most important things about this steak and hamburger show is that you learn as much as you can about the quality of meat. And that means making a friend of your butcher. He's absolutely your best friend in the world as far as meat goes. And then also make every effort you can to learn about meat cuts, and you won't be disappointed. Well, that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appétit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Furniture and accessories courtesy of Design Research Incorporated.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
This is just a plain, ordinary yellow-skinned onion, but it made a French soup famous. Soup à l'oignon. And here it is, hot out of the oven, bubbling, rich and brown and filled with cheese and laced with good French brandy. And I'm just going to serve you some so you'll see how it looks. Oh, how it smells so good. We're doing soup à l'oignon gratiné next time on The French Chef. This is soup à l'oignon gratiné. I'm just putting a lot of cheese on the top of it. Then a little bit of oil goes on. And then it's going to go into the oven. And it's going to bake so all the cheese melts. And it's going to come out wonderfully browned and beautiful smelling. We're doing making your own onion soup today on The French Chef.
French Chef is made possible by a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated and a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Welcome to the French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Whenever you do French onion soup, you just need an awful lot of onions. And if you're going to have an awful lot of sliced onions, you've got to have a good sharp knife. And the kind of knife that is used by most professionals for chopping is wedge-shaped, and it's called a chef's knife. And this one, which I like very much because it's so nice and heavy that it does most of the work for you, has a blade 11 inches long. But you can use a shorter knife like this, which is 7.5 inches long. But if you have these two sizes, 11 and 7.5 inches, you can slice and chop up just about anything you want. And whenever you have them, when you're going to buy knives, you have to be sure that you get a knife that will cut. You often hear people say that a knife is supposed to hold an edge, but if you watch your butcher, and he's always sharpening his knife all the time, you know that you can't get a knife that will hold an edge. What you want is just a knife that will take an edge, a knife that you can sharpen. And I've found that the knives that you can sharpen the best are plain old-fashioned rustable steel called carbon steel. And that's what these are. These are French ones, and I've had them for an awfully long time. But you can now buy them in quite a few of the import shops or at many hardware and kitchenware stores. And if you can't seem to find what you want, ask your butcher, because he'll know where to get good knives. And again, if you watch your butcher, you notice that he's always sharpening his knife. And to do that, he uses a butcher's steel. And be sure when you get yourself a butcher's steel, get a great big heavy-duty one. This has a steel that's 12 inches long, and it has a guard up here, and that is so that when you're holding the steel and you sharpen the knife, you won't come in there and just cut your hand off. And then it has a handle and a thing to hang it up by. I got this at my hardware store, and it cost just about $2. And when you sharpen it, you go on each side of the steel, and your knife you raise at about a 20-degree angle. See, just about like that, and you come down and up, always at the 20-degree angle, and then you take on the other side, sharpening the other side of it, which is down and up, this kind of a movement. And if your knife is very dull, you can go sort of 1 or 2 times on each side, and then finish off like this. And then the knife is so sharp that when you feel it, it feels very sharp. And also if you just lay it on top of a tomato, just the weight of the knife will cut through the tomato. Or if you laid it over your hand and just drew it across, the weight would cut your hand right down to the bone. In other words, a knife is a tool, and it's got to be very sharp. And they're your life in your kitchen, because it's so much easier to cook if you have sharp knives. In fact, I find usually when I go visiting and I'm asked to cook, I can't find any sharp knives, so I always take my own with me. So I conclude that not many householders have sharp knives, but they're so easy to sharpen, and they're not very expensive. But when you do get good knives and keep them nice and sharp, you really have to care for them like a baby. After you finish cutting with them, you should immediately wash them by hand. And the carbon steel ones stain quite easily. I've got one here that I rub with lemon juice, and it just looks awful. But it's very easy to clean. You just take some steel wool and dampen it just very slightly, wring it out, and take some scouring powder and put it on the side of the sink or in a little jar. And then just rub it over the knife hard. You see, all that stain has come out. That's just lemon juice, but if you let the knife sit around with something like that on it, it will immediately stain. But as you can see, that it cleans off very easily. And then put it under water. But be sure, get into the habit of always having the blunt edge against your hand. If you have the sharp edge, you could just cut your hand right in two. So get in the habit of that. of using the tool correctly, and then dry it off. You don't ever want to put a good knife in the dishwasher. You don't ever want to wash it in the sink with a whole lot of other instruments, because if you do, it will other things will bang against the edge and break it off. And for that very same reason, you don't want to leave it lying loose in the drawer. Use either a knife box or a knife holder, or what's awfully good are these magnetic knife holders like this. See, it just sticks on the wall like that. And this one's a very strong one. This is both for tools and knives. They have some rather fancy looking ones that aren't as strong as this, but be sure to get one that is both for tools and knives, and then you'll find that your knife will just stay on, and you'll never have any trouble about hurting the edge. Then, when you're going to chop onions, once you've got your sharp knife, you want to be able to chop things very fast, like this. See how fast that goes? And there your onions are all in slices. And this is something that you have to practice on. And I'll show you how you start out. You take your onion and you cut it through at the root end, like that. And then you lay it flat. And you take a few little slices off the root and a few little slices off the stem end. And then laying it flat again, there's your thumb at one end, and put your fingers at the other end. And your fingernails are bent back, and there are your knuckles sticking out a little bit, and those act as a guide. And your knife you hold with your thumb and your forefinger on the top of the blade, and your fingers gripping around the handle. And you don't put your finger on top of the blade. You have it under the blade. This may seem a little bit awkward at first, but the object of this is that your knife should be an extension of your hand. And if you have your finger on it like that, you don't have quite as much wrist movement as you do when you're this way. So practice holding it this way, and in about several days it will feel convenient. And then when you chop, you come straight down like that and out. You see now I'm coming straight down and then pushing out a little bit. That's the reason you have this wedge shape. See, I'm coming against my knuckle like that, and then I'm, with my thumb, see, I push my fingers back a little bit at each chop. That's why you have your thumb, because that guides you. There, I'll do another one. There's the cut side down, and then cut off this little root end, and then cut off the little stem end, and then bracing it with your thumb, and your fingers pointed back, and your knife held this way, come straight down. You'll have to start doing slowly at first, and then gradually get faster and faster and faster. Like that. You see, if you have really mastered your knife, and this will probably take you maybe a week or maybe two, you can really plow through 2 or 3 pounds of onions in really 5 minutes or less. But these are the kinds of things, if you're going to do any serious cooking, this is the dog work that you should practice on and get, so that you can do it just as fast as possible. Because then you won't be upset if you have a recipe that says that you have to have 8 cups of thinly sliced onions. It's very easy to do, and you rather enjoy it because it's something that you enjoy, take a pride in. See, now as soon as I'm finished, I dry the knife, and be sure to dry it also that way, so that the sharp end is away from you. And now we're going to do onion soup for 6 to 8 people, so we want 5 to 6 cups of onions, or that would be 1.5 to 2 pounds of yellow onions. And you notice that I was chopping those onions and I didn't cry at all. And I think that's one of the main reasons, is because I've got this great sharp knife, and it cuts right through the onions, and so they don't splatter. If I had a dull knife, the onion juice would splatter up into my eyes. And now after you've cut all the onions, you can get the onion's taste off your hands very easily. Wash them first in cold water, rinse them off, and then sprinkle about a teaspoon of salt in your wet hands and then rub the salt in, wash it off, and then wash it again in warm water. And if you find that you still have a little bit of onion on your hands, just repeat the process. But I think you'll find that this will get all the onion off very easily. And now, when you've got all of your onions chopped up, you're going to then cook them. And this soup calls for browned onions. And we have five to 6 cups for 6 people. And we're going to cook them in oil and butter. I'm going to put in about a tablespoon of cooking oil and about 2 tablespoons of butter. And then in go the onions. And now I think you'll find with this onion soup, if you're going to make it all yourself, you're going to get much the best flavor if you use fresh onions, because you want to get, it's onion soup, so you've got to get the most flavor that you can. And then you want to stir the onions around until they're fully covered with your oil and butter. And then to brown onions, you do it in 2 steps. The first one is called in French étuve, which means cooking the onions until they're tender. And then after you've cooked them until they're tender, then you brown them. But to do this étuve, or cooking until tender, you cook them over moderate heat with a cover on for about 20 minutes until they're tender and translucent. Because if you tried to brown the onions right now, you'd have browned, sort of raw onions, and they wouldn't taste very good. So when you're doing the onions, this part takes somewhat of a long time, but it's this, if you're making your own onion soup, which is so very important, is to brown them properly. So cook them covered for about 20 minutes, and then when they're done, cook down and see the difference. Those 5 or 6 cups now have cooked down to about, say, about a cup and a half. And they're nice and tender. And you could, at this point, you could use the onions to make a white onion soup if you wanted to. And then when they've cooked down this way, you are ready to brown them. And for that, you set them over moderately high heat, and it's going to take you about 20 to 30 minutes to brown them properly. And to help them brown, you add a little pinch of sugar, and you also add some salt. And I left the salt way over here while I was washing my hands. You don't want very much sugar, but just this little tiny bit, about, say, half to a quarter of a teaspoonful. The sugar will caramelize, and that helps the onions to brown. And then we'll put in about a teaspoon of salt. And then you have to keep stirring them fairly frequently. So, in other words, when you're cooking them, stay quite near them. And you'll notice as they start browning, they will begin attaching a little bit to the bottom of the pan. Be sure that you have a heavy bottom pan. Otherwise, if you have a thin bottom pan, you'll find that the onions will burn on the bottom. Then you just keep stirring them around, and finally they will brown and look like this. And this is amazing. I'll take these things out so you can see, but look at how little there are of those onions that you started out with 5 or 6 cups, because there's so much water in them. So when you have your onions browned like this, you can use them for all kinds of other things, saying smothering steaks or hamburgers in onions. And these are just perfectly delicious just the way they are. And now we're ready to start making a soup out of them. And we want first to have about 3 tablespoons of flour in, because this gives the soup a little body and thickening. So that's 1 heaping tablespoon and 1 level tablespoon, and that makes 3 3 tablespoons. And this you want to cook over sort of moderate heat. And if you find that you don't have quite enough butter in, just add a little bit more, because you want to make a paste of it, because you want to cook the flour and brown it lightly. And this also you want to do rather slowly so that you brown it nicely. I think I have my heat a little bit too high there now. And this you would cook about 2 or 3 minutes. I'm not going to do the whole thing, but when you do it, you cook it for 2 or 3 minutes until the flour slowly browns. Then you're ready to add the liquid to it. And if you're going to do onion soup yourself, it would be too bad to use canned stock with it, because it has beef stock. If you had canned stock, then it would taste just like canned onion soup, so you might just as well have started out with canned onion soup in the first place. And so you'd have a homemade stock, and this is a great mixture of beef shanks and chicken necks and water and vegetables, and this is simmered for 5 or 6 hours, and it looks awful, but it's perfectly delicious. And I want to have about 6 cups in all. But I'm just going to put in a little bit first and then stir it around to make sure that it's blended nicely with the flour, and also so that I've scraped up all the sort of brown onion juices in the bottom of the pan. As a matter of fact, I think I should stir that up with a wire whip to make sure that the flour is all mixed up nicely. And then the rest of the stock goes in about 6 cups. But if you're going to make a stock yourself, we've done a lot of them. Particularly, I remember a great turkey stock. Just save all the bones and things, and then buy a little bit of fresh meat, and all you need to do is just to put water and carrots and onions and celery and salt in, and then just simmer it. When you come up with a perfectly beautiful stock. And then set this over heat and let it bring up to the simmer. And then this, of course, is now only browned onions and beef stock. But you want to add some little French touches, such as wine and herbs. You can use either white wine or red wine. I'm going to use some California mountain red wine and put in just about a cup there. That is quite a cup, a little bit more. But it's all going to cook down. And then put in some herbs like a bay leaf, and I'm going to use about a half a teaspoon of powdered sage. And then that is to cook very slowly. You don't even need to cover it. You can partially cook it, but let it cook very slowly for 30 or 40 minutes to get all the flavor out. And now, if you were using canned or dehydrated onion soups, and there's some awfully good ones on the market, just follow the package directions, and then when you've rehydrated it or heated it up, then to add your own touches to it. Then put in some wine and bay leaf and herbs and let that simmer for 20 or 30 minutes, so that, because you have to, when you're using wine, you have to let it cook out. And then let it simmer until it tastes perfectly delicious, because it's cooked down, and that's all there is to the cooking. And be sure then, before you're ready to serve it, that you very, very carefully taste it. It has just the right amount of salt and pepper and everything else, and you can do it way ahead of time and just let it sit if you want. And you can serve it perfectly plain, just as it is. Just serve it in soup cups with some French bread and cheese. Or if you want to be very French, you will serve croûtes with it. And croûtes are spelled C for crust, R-O-U-T-E-S. And that's just what they are. They're little crusts of toasted French bread, which are sort of nice and crisp, sort of hard toasted French bread, and they're perfectly delicious. And I think they add a great deal to French onion soup. Now we're going to slice Just take some homemade type white bread, French bread if possible, and cut it into 1-inch slices. I'll just make 4 of these. Then place it on a baking sheet. And then you bake it in a 325 oven for 15 minutes on each side. And what I like to do is to take a little light olive oil and paint each side of them with a little oil. And that just seems to give them a little better flavor. And that's just half an hour in a 325 oven, and they're all made. And they come out just like that. And I always make quite a few extra ones because they're so good. But what we're going to do also with these fruits is to make onion soup gratiné. And this is going to be baked in the oven. You can use any kind of a casserole, baking dish, souffle dish, whatever you like. This is a French earthenware casserole, which is sort of typical, so I'm going to use that. Now this, we will say that this soup is simmered for 30 or 40 minutes and is perfect in every respect. And so you could serve it in this casserole I have, but I'm just going to be fancy and put it in the earthenware casserole. There goes all the onion in. Then you can add some more French touches, such as a little bit of cognac, about 2 or 3 tablespoons. That certainly would never hurt any soup at all, and that all cooks down. Then you can add some more, and this is particularly useful if you're using boughten soup. Take a raw onion and grate that, and you think you've had enough onions in, but this little grated raw onion adds that je ne sais quoi. Then so it'll be cheesy and sticky, so that when you lift it up, it springs out. Take some Swiss cheese and just slice it. Well, this is probably I'll use about 2 ounces, and slice it through with the grater, and that goes in. And that's going to give it that sort of nice stringy quality. And then just take your toasted croûtes, and they go on top. And then the cheese goes on top. And this you would use a combination of grated Swiss cheese and Parmesan cheese. And be sure that you put a big, thick layer on, like about 1/2 inch. Be sure that you get all the toast covered, because when it goes into the oven, if you don't have all the toast covered, some of the toast will burn. And then take a little bit of olive oil or melted butter and pour that over the cheese. And that helps it brown. And then this should be done just at the last minute, and then you're ready to put it into the oven. And this bakes in a 350-degree oven. And this bakes for just about half an hour. And I have one here that's been baked for just about half an hour. Out she comes. You see, that's all bubbling nicely. But the cheese hasn't browned very much. So then you put it under the broiler for just about a minute just to brown the cheese very lightly. Gosh, it's so hot, I better use some pot holders. I tried thinking that I could both brown the cheese at the same time as baking it in the oven the other day, and I put one in a 425-degree oven and found that it bubbled up so much that all the croutons sort of had a tumbled effect, so that didn't work at all. So you have to do it in 2 stages. And now, while this is browning, here you can of course serve the soup in little individual cups, and you don't have to gratinate it. So you just put a croûte in the bottom, and then pour some onion soup on the top. And then just put on some cheese, and you can serve it like that. Or if you want to make more of a meal of it, you put the crouton, and then you can put a poached egg on top of the crouton, and then the cheese on top of that. Now, the way this is now, you could put, say, 2 or 3 croutes in and just bake and brown this in the oven. So you have all kinds of ways to serve it. Now, I better go back before that. It's really browning here. That's beautiful. There you are. I think that possibly browned a little bit too much, but I don't know. It gives a very good effect. But remember, when you're going to do the gratinée, you can get the soup done as far ahead as you want. As a matter of fact, I think if you did it a day ahead, it would probably even taste better. But don't do the gratinée until the very last minute, and then take it right into the dining room. Because you want it to be bubbling when it comes in. Then you're ready to serve it. You have a big ladle. You usually have to cut down through the top a little bit. There you are. That's a wonderful smell. Very appetizing one. And if you want to serve wine, I think something like a California Mountain Red or a Beaujolais go extremely well with it. And this is such a gratinée soup. It's very rich with all that cheese and toast in it. And I really think you don't need much else along with your meal than a green salad. And you might want to follow it with fruit. So this is really the soup that made the onion famous. And it's your own French onion soup, whether you started it from scratch or from out of the can. When you've added all these little French touches, who's going to know? So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appetit.
The French Chef has been made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation and a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking. The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.
Here are carrots, leeks, celery, pork, beef, a sausage, and a chicken. We're doing dinner in a pot today on The French Chef. Welcome to The French Chef. I'm Julia Child. Today we're doing dinner in a pot. It's a sumptuous French boiled dinner called pâté normand. Pâté means just a big pot full of wonderful food, and that's just what this is. We have all these vegetables, and then we have all of our meats. We have pork or veal and beef and chicken and sausage, and they all cook together in glorious harmony. And that's very easy on the cook, and it's a wonderful meal. You can, of course, you don't have to use all of this variety. You can just use beef only. In that case, with beef and vegetables, it would be called pot au feu, or pot on the fire. Or if you just used a chicken, that would be poule au pot, or chicken in the pot. And the great thing about this is you can do it all ahead of time. It's easy on the cook, and the guests have a simply wonderful time. And you end up with not only all your meat and vegetables, a one-dish meal, but you have a perfectly glorious soup to boot. So we shall start in with it right now. And now we have our beef. And the beef, this is a piece of chuck that comes from the ribs up in the shoulder. And this is called an undercut. And this is an extremely nice piece of beef you can use either for boiling or for braising. And if it has the bones and the fat in it, it costs about 69 cents a pound. And if it's all been trimmed and boned the way this piece has, it's about 89 cents a pound. But you can use much more inexpensive cuts, say from the leg or round, or from other parts of the shoulder. And now whenever you're going to boil beef, which we're going to do, you want to tie it up so it'll keep its shape while it's cooking. And usually your butcher will do this, but it's rather nice to know how to do it yourself. I'm going to put a tie right around the outside like that. And then I'm going to tie up some other all around the circumference of it, and that will make it sort of look a little bit like a sausage. It's a good idea when you tie to make a double twist of your threads, of your string. And then you can twist it around, and it won't loosen up when you tie it. And it just needs about 3 ties so it'll keep its shape well. If you didn't tie it up, because particularly in the shoulder piece, there are quite a different groups of muscles, as you can see, and they would all separate, and then it wouldn't look as nice when you were serving it. And then when you have your beef, it depends on what cut and usually what price you pay, how long it takes to cook. This is an extremely good piece of beef from a fine carcass, and this won't take more than about 2.5 hours. If you have a tougher piece, it may take 3 to 4 hours. And so you estimate your timing. I've lost my spring. You estimate the timing of how long this whole thing is going to take by how long each piece of meat's going to take. So if this was taking 4 hours, then you'd probably count 6 hours in all of stewing, but that means it doesn't mean you have to look at it while you're doing it. I mean, you don't have to look at it very much. You just put it in the pot and let it go. Now I'm tying a long piece of string here and putting that in the pot. Then I'm going to tie the string onto the handle, and that is so that I can lift it out and see how it is. In case, say, the beef got done before other things were done, I could just lift it out and then put it aside and then put it back into the pot again when it was time to heat it up again. And now here we have a rolled shoulder of pork. And this one's all been tied, and I have a string on it. And for stewing cuts, it's nice to have meat that has a little bit of fat and a little bit of lean in it. But if you're doing pork particularly, be sure that you have all the extra fat cut out of it. This is the shoulder butt. It's part of the front arm. And this is a very nice piece for either stewing or braising. And if you don't want to use pork, you can use a veal shoulder that's tied and rolled this way. So that goes into the pot. That I'm going to tie on also. And then if the pork here weighs about about 4 pounds and the beef weighs about 6 pounds. And we have enough here to take care of about 12 or 14 people. You can take care of 50 people if you want. It just depends on the size of your pot. I have a sister-in-law who has an enormous boiler like this called the Happy Home Laundry, and she can take care of about 50 people. And then we have our chicken that's going in, and if you've noticed, when you go to your market, there's numerous types of chicken. You have the youngest one, which is called a broiler, and that's very young, and the flesh is very tender, and you can't boil a broiler. You can only cook that by dry heat, like roasting or broiling. And then you have the next oldest, which is the frying chicken, which you can use either for frying, roasting, or fricasseeing. And then you have your roaster, which is, as it says, just for roasting. And then your older chicken is called a fowl, or stewing chicken. And that is a little over a year old usually. And when you pick out a stewing chicken, which this is, you want to be sure that it's a good-looking chicken with lovely smooth skin and nicely filled out in the breast and in the legs. If it's scrawny and the skin is sort of scaly, that means it's probably an old hen, and you just can't cook that tender at all. The stewing chicken has to be cooked by stewing. That means slowly simmering in water, which this is going to do. Now, another way that you can tell the age of a chicken is the end of the breastbone here. You see there's your breastbone that comes up there, and with a stewing chicken, the bone is completely hard here. You can't bend it. But in a roaster or a frying chicken, there's cartilage from about here to there, and you can bend the tip. So that's always a good idea to look. If you have a roasting chicken that looks awfully big, you would, and you found that this was a hard bone, you'd think it was probably better if you stewed it. Now we're going to stuff this chicken. You can put the chicken just as it is, just tie it up and put it in the pot. But I thought you would like to see a nice stewing, a nice way to stuff chicken. And we're going to have a breadcrumb and giblet stuffing. And I have here, these are the giblets. You know, they always come in a little package in the chicken. And I have the gizzard, which has been peeled and sauteed, and then about a cup of diced onions that were sauteed in butter, and then I chopped up the heart and the liver and sauteed them all, and it makes a very nice savory mixture here. And for the breadcrumbs, you want to be sure to use stale bread. And the easiest way to do the crumbs, I think, is to get a grater like this. And be sure that your bread is a little bit sort of hard and stale like that. And just rub it through the coarse end of your grater. Just like that. And if you find that you have fresh bread and you want to make it stale, just spread it all out in a roasting pan in the oven and let it dry out in about a 200 oven for half an hour or so. And then you want breadcrumbs about of that size, not too fine. And then as to the amount of stuffing, it is presumably that sort of a fairly good thing to go by is that, say, this chicken is about 5.5 pounds ready to cook, and you use 3/4 of a cup of stuffing per pound of ready to cook weight. So that means we want about 4 cups of stuffing. So we put our breadcrumbs into a big bowl, and then we want to moisten them with a little bit of bouillon or stock, or you can even moisten them with a little bit of milk. You don't want it to get too damp, just a little bit. And then you also want some butter in with it. We have the butter already. I cooked these giblets in about 4 tablespoons of butter. And they go in. Then, if you have any chopped scallions or onions, you can always add those too. They're always good in a stuffing. And then about half a teaspoon of thyme. And we want about 3 or 4 tablespoons or 1/4 of a cup of parsley. You can put celery in too if you want. Then we have salt and pepper. I'm going to put in about almost a teaspoon of salt, and then several good rinds of fresh pepper. Then we have an egg, and the egg binds the stuffing together a little bit. And then you just stir it all up. You see that egg is holding it together a little bit. And then you want to be sure and taste it to see that you've got enough salt and pepper in. Oh, that's good. You can put sage in rather than thyme. And now you truss the neck end of the chicken first. And this is a French trussing needle here. It's just a big metal needle. And if you don't have one of those, you can just use a wooden knitting needle and drill a hole in it. And you put the wings akimbo like that so they'll stay in place. That's sometimes a little difficult in a hen. You just have to break it a little bit at that point. There. Then you lift the legs up. I'll use this wooden knitting needle and just poke it right through. Bring your string out. See, there's one end of the string there. Then you turn it over and go through your, I think actually I'm going to just truss it this way. And then if it has enough neck skin, you try to get through that. And then just come through on the other side. Oh, that's going to hold it there. Pull it through. Then you use your same system of the twist so that it will hold together. So you give a double twist to your string that way, and then twist it again around so that it won't come loose while you're tying it. And then your stuffing goes in. It's a good idea to put a little bit of salt in the cavity first. And if you have any extra fat like that, just pull it out. But save the fat because it's awfully good for cooking with. And then you just put in your stuffing. And you want to be sure when you're stuffing a chicken that you don't overstuff it because it always swells a little bit. You should leave about an inch of unfilled space. And then if you have any extra stuffing left, you can put it in a little mold or dish and bake it in a pan of water in the oven. Cover it up. There. Then you just tie out the other end. If they've made a big hole in this vent part of the chicken, when they've cleaned it, you often you'll have to sew up the vent, but I think in this case it's all right. And on this, you go right through the end of the breastbone, and then through the top other part of the leg. Pack your stuffing down a little bit. This is a very undignified position for the chicken, but it's easier to do that when things don't dribble out. There. And see, tying it that way, you don't see that it's perfectly well closed, so that you don't have to worry about the stuffing coming out. And then that goes into the pot. But I should have added a piece of string onto that also, so that can be pulled out. I should have, when I did that last tie, have left a long piece of string. And that goes in, and then we tie the string again there. Then we put water into the pot. In this case, we're lucky that all of these things take about the same amount of time to cook. We have, see, the stewing chicken takes between 2.5 and 3 hours. If you could also put it in, you can cut it up and put it in, then it only takes about an hour and a half. It never looks quite as fancy. You want to have enough water in there to cover your chicken and then also cover the vegetables which are to come. I think I'm going to have just about enough. I'll just put in the rest of this water here. There. Then we have our vegetables which go in. And the vegetables, you can put in soup vegetables to cook along with the chicken, and then your vegetable garnish would go in they should cook just about an hour, or a little over an hour, because you want the taste of this cooking soup and the vegetables all to sort of give a community of taste. Now here are leeks, and leeks for some reason seem rather hard to get, but they're available everywhere, and if your market doesn't carry them, just ask them that they do. It's a wonderful vegetable for soup or just as a vegetable. And when you get it, it looks like that. It has a slight onion taste, but it's more perfuming. It has the root end on here, and that you cut off. Then you take a knife and you slit it that way, and you slit it the length the other way. Then you open up the leaves and wash them under cold running water, because there's always a lot of dirt in the leaves. So you'll be sure and wash them thoroughly. And then, after they're washed, this one hasn't been, you can either wrap them in cheesecloths or you can tie them together, again for easy removal. And you tie it just the way you tie bunches of asparagus. One tie at one end and one tie at another. And then these are very easy to remove. And then there's a tie at the lower end there. I forgot to put any salt into my pot. This is kosher salt. It's sort of a rock salt. It's very nice because you can pick it up with your fingers. And that would need probably about 2 or 3 tablespoons, but you could put in enough at the beginning, and then you can add more later. And then you'd also want, for further seasoning, you'd want an herb packet. So we will use parsley and some garlic. I'll use about 3 cloves, and bay leaf. I'll even use 4 cloves because that's a big pot. And then tie those up in cheesecloth. And that again is so that the herbs won't disperse through your soup as they're cooking. So in they go. And you'd also would put some thyme and other seasonings in if you like. Then we would have the rest of our vegetable garniture. There are carrots, those are just peeled and quartered. And those are, you can wrap in cheesecloth also, as you'll see later on how this works. When we take it all out again, it's so much easier to have it in cheesecloth. And there, those go in, and if you have onions or turnips, those would also go in. And the sausage here, this is a smoked Polish sausage, that would go in half an hour before the end. So we'll just pretend that it's half an hour before the end, and that goes in. And be sure when you're using your cheesecloth that it's washed cheesecloth, because it always has sort of a taste of sizing, or so that would, you pick that up in your soup. And now I'm going to clear the decks and show you what we do for when your great pâté is all done. And this, for the timing of the pâté, because it can sit and wait, you don't have to, it's a good idea to start it a bit ahead of time. And say if you had, for one like this, I'd probably start it about 4 or 5 hours before I was going to serve it, because it can wait. This great big pot of water takes a long time to cool off, and it's better to have it done than not have it done. And so here's what we have already done. And you see, yes. Now you'll see how nice it is to have all your vegetables tied in separate packages. We have here our leeks, and that's a lovely aromatic soup that we have here. And that you can serve either as a first course for your dinner, or you can save it and use it another day. So there are leeks in a little plate, and then we have there are onions. Just cut off the cheesecloth. Cheesecloth you can get anywhere, and usually in any market, and it just comes in a little package, and then you just wash it out, and it's ready to use. There are onions, and we have carrots. It's hot. You could tie all your vegetables together in one bag, but then if you wanted to make a pretty decoration, it would be a little hard to separate them out. Now let's see what we have in here. There's our beef. Now with these you can tell when they're done by when a fork pierces them easily. And as soon as that happens, then you know that they're done and are ready. And if the beef is done ahead of time, you just would take it out and let it sit in a little bit of the stock, because it'll keep more juicy if it's sitting in liquid. You see that's kept together quite nicely by the spring. Now let's see what else we have. There's our pork. You can see what fun this is, really, because most people don't realize that you can just cook all of these things together. You wouldn't cook lamb along with it because that has too pronounced a flavor. You could cook ham, but then everything would taste like ham. It's a good idea to have some really sharp shears in the kitchen. I've got all those strings off. Well, there's a little bit more. Still a little bit more. That goes off. Now, what have we got? Here's some more sausages. These ones, rather than the Polish sausage, I got the Polish sausage is already smoked, and these are fresh Italian sausages, and they're very nice. Get that off. They have a very good flavor. Then, let's see what else we've got in here. You could, if you wanted to serve this, I'm going to serve this on a platter so you can see things better, but you can't get them all untied and then return them back to sort of a serving pot if you have one. And then people don't know what you're about. They're simply amazed to see all these things coming out. Now we have chicken in here. Now this one, I cooked the chicken already all cut up so that you could see it done both ways. That's terribly simple. You just wrap it again in your cheesecloth bag. And then you don't have the problem of carving. There. Now, we arrange it. Ends of the platter. I sprinkle a little herbs on the chicken before I put them in the bag, so that they would have even more flavor. And then your meats go in the middle. This pork came apart just a little bit. Then we'll arrange some of the vegetables around think those leeks look very pretty. You could also have celery stalks if you wanted to. Leeks on either side. Then we have onions. Turnips are very nice. You wouldn't, unless you, I don't think cabbage is a very good idea, because if you want to use your stock for anything else, it all tastes of cabbage. And then we have our carrots, which make a pretty decoration. But if you're a really artistic type, you can do all kinds of decorations. I'll put the sausages there in the middle, a little more parsley, and we're ready to serve. That really is, as I said at the beginning, it is sumptuous looking. And with it, you'd serve a rosé wine or a red wine and some French bread and either some rice or some potatoes simmered in some of your soup stock. That makes a perfectly lovely meal. And I'll serve a portion so you can see how it works. You carve off a piece. Everybody should get a little piece of everything. We have here our pork, the sausage, and beef. Chicken, yes. I'll give somebody a piece of the breast. Some carrot. The wonderful thing about all of this is that you can get it done ahead about 2 hours at least, and then just let it sit in its pot, and you could warm it up a little bit again. So there we are, and you have only one pot to wash. And it's a great deal of fun for your guests and everybody. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appetit.
Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Furniture and accessories courtesy of Design Research Incorporated.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Safeway stores.